In the early months of 1942, Clark Gable appeared to have reached a place few people ever do. Professionally, he stood unchallenged. He was Hollywood's most bankable star, admired across generations, trusted by studios, and embraced by audiences who saw in him strength, certainty, and authority. Personally, he had something even rarer. He had peace. That peace came in the form of Carole Lombard, an actress whose brilliance was not defined by glamour alone, but by intelligence, courage, and an instinctive understanding of who she was. Their marriage was not merely famous, it was visibly alive. Friends, colleagues, and even skeptical studio executives noticed it. Clark Gable, long known for emotional distance and restraint, had softened. He laughed more easily. He seemed present. For once, the man behind the legend appeared complete. And then, without warning, everything ended. Not through scandal, not through illness, not through the slow erosion of time, but through chance. Through a coin tossed casually into the air, its result accepted without ceremony, without dread, without the faintest sense of finality. This is the story of how that single moment led to the most devastating tragedy of Clark Gable's life. How it took Carole Lombard from the world at just 33 years old. And how the loss reshaped one of Hollywood's most iconic figures forever. Carole Lombard was not born into certainty. Her rise through Hollywood was built on persistence, intelligence, and a refusal to conform to expectations placed on women in the studio era. While many actresses were molded into elegant symbols of restraint, Lombard embraced comedy, physical, fearless, and unapologetically sharp. She was witty in private, outspoken in public, and politically engaged in ways that set her apart. Long before patriotism became fashionable in Hollywood, Lombard believed that fame carried responsibility. Clark Gable, by contrast, had spent much of his early life guarded. His ascent to stardom was accompanied by emotional distance, shaped by difficult relationships, and the immense pressure of maintaining a carefully constructed public image. By the time he met Lombard, he was admired, but not necessarily known. Their relationship changed that. They married in 1939, and almost immediately, those around them noticed something different. Lombard challenged Gable intellectually. She teased him. She treated him as an equal, not an untouchable icon. For the first time in his adult life, Gable did not seem to be performing. Then, history intervened. In December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor altered the course of American life. The nation entered World War II with shock, fear, and determination. Hollywood, as both an industry and a cultural force, was quickly mobilized to support the war effort. Carole Lombard did not hesitate. She volunteered to travel to Indiana, her home state, to lead a major war bond rally. At the time, such trips were demanding and exhausting, but Lombard viewed them as essential. She believed morale mattered. She believed participation mattered. The rally exceeded all expectations. Through speeches, appearances, and relentless engagement, Lombard helped raise more than $2 million for the war effort. In 1942, this was an extraordinary achievement, one that placed her among the most impactful civilian contributors to national defense. When the event concluded, Lombard was tired, but deeply satisfied. She had done what she believed was right. Now, she wanted to return home. She wanted to return to Clark Gable. Travel during wartime was complicated, and commercial aviation was still in its early, relatively dangerous stages. Lombard typically avoided flying, preferring the reliability of trains. Her mother, Elizabeth Peters, was especially fearful of air travel, and Gable's press agent and close friend, Otto Winkler, shared those concerns. There was no professional urgency, no contractual deadline, no unavoidable reason to rush. But Lombard wanted to be home quickly. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps optimism, perhaps the simple human tendency to believe that tragedy happens elsewhere, to other people. Whatever the reason, the decision came down to chance. Unable to agree, Lombard and her companions flipped a coin. The coin favored flight. On January 16, 1942, Carole Lombard boarded TWA Flight 3 in Las Vegas, accompanied by her mother and Otto Winkler. The aircraft carried 22 people in total and was scheduled to fly west to Los Angeles. Shortly after takeoff, the plane veered off course. Moments later, it crashed into Potosi Mountain. There were no survivors. When Clark Gable learned that the aircraft was missing, he reacted not as a celebrity, but as a husband in shock. He left immediately for Las Vegas, refusing to wait for official confirmation. Witnesses later described him pacing alone near the base of the mountain, silent, visibly drained, and unreachable. For hours, search crews worked through difficult terrain. When confirmation finally came, it was absolute. Carole Lombard was dead. So was her mother. So was Otto Winkler. All 22 lives had ended instantly. Among the wreckage, investigators recovered fragments of personal belongings. One of them was part of a ruby brooch Gable had once given Lombard. When it was returned to him, he accepted it without comment. He placed the fragment in a locket and wore it for the rest of his life. Those close to him said that moment marked a permanent shift, an emotional fracture that never fully healed. Public mourning followed quickly. Carole Lombard was hailed as a national symbol of sacrifice. She became the first female film star to die in service of the American war effort, and the country honored her accordingly. Clark Gable did not participate in the spectacle. Friends said he withdrew almost completely. The house they had shared became unbearable. Hollywood, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien. Without Lombard, the structures that had given his life meaning no longer held. Within months, Gable made a decision that stunned the film industry. At 41 years old, older than most recruits, and vastly more valuable to studios, Clark Gable enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. Official statements framed the move as patriotic duty. Privately, many who knew him believed something else was at work. Gable did not request safety or symbolic service. He trained rigorously and served as an aerial gunner aboard B-17 bombers flying combat missions over Europe. These were not ceremonial flights. Casualties were high. Survival was uncertain. Biographers and historians have debated his motivation for decades. Some argue he was fulfilling a sense of responsibility to his country. Others, including close friends, believed he had little interest in self-preservation. To them, his enlistment felt less like bravery and more like surrender, a quiet willingness to accept death if it came. Gable survived the war, but survival did not restore what had been lost. When he returned to Hollywood, he resumed acting and eventually remarried. On screen, he remained compelling. The image endured. The voice, the presence, the authority, all remained intact. But those who worked closely with him noticed something missing. He was more guarded, more private, less spontaneous. Friends said the joy Lombard had brought into his life never returned. He continued living, but no longer seemed anchored by purpose. The man audiences saw was still Clark Gable, but something essential had withdrawn behind the image. Carole Lombard was not merely a memory. She was the emotional center of his life. In 1960, shortly after completing The Misfits, Clark Gable suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 59. In death, he made one final request. He wanted to be buried beside Carole Lombard. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, they rest together, without spectacle, without dramatization, just proximity, just silence. This story endures not because of celebrity, but because of its truth. It reminds us that chance is not impressed by status, that love does not offer immunity from loss, and that a single, ordinary decision, made without fear, without foresight, can alter the trajectory of a life forever. Clark Gable lived nearly 2 decades after Carole Lombard's death, but the man he had become beside her ended on January 16, 1942. What followed was survival, not restoration. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy behind the legend.